So great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your generosity with your time. I know the time today is an invaluable asset that all of us have, and it's something that once you spend it, you can never get back. So I really grateful for you and your generous time for showing up and sitting down and speaking with me today.
Oh, don't say that, Natalia. The pleasure's all mine. I'm so selfishly interested in having this conversation with you.
Oh, good. Likewise. So it's going to be the same. And I'm not going to introduce you. I decide not to introduce any of my guests because I assume that people either know them, and if they don't know them, they'll get a chance to get to know you throughout the course of this introduction. And I will link all of you social media information below so they can explore further. I find you particularly as not only a tarologist, if I may use the term to describe you, but also as somebody who is very knowledgeable about tarot and the cards, very interesting, because I feel, and this is me, I feel that we have a lot in common in the sense that we have dual kind of professions, right? I'm a psychologist, you're an attorney, and both of our jobs, I feel, are very cerebral and tend to be analytical. Psychology, maybe not so much, but I myself, very cerebral. Do you find that in yourself that your career path as an attorney, as a lawyer, is very analytical and very kind of cerebral and cognitive oriented?
I think what's interesting is in these particular paths, like law, you're trained to be extremely analytical. And then in paths like tarot and divination, in a way, you're trained to be more intuitive and psychic and feeling. But then what's interesting is the best lawyers, I think if you only follow that trained path, you only achieve mediocrity in your profession. And in order to really be great, if you look at all the greatest attorneys, the ones who actually create change in the legal system, the ones that really progress the legal system to actually achieve justice, are the ones who are more intuitive. They might not use the word psychic, but they're absolutely using psychic ability to get ahead in their profession. And they're more intuitive. Even scientists who are truly great at invention and innovation are intuitive and psychic. And then in the tarot and divination world, the psychic shamanic realms, in order to, I think that intuitive creative energy is very fluid and intangible, and you have to concretize it in order for you to produce work product or to have it drive some kind of concrete measurable change. So for psychic ability to drive concrete measurable change, you do need some level of analytical skill. You might not use that word analytics, but I think that's exactly what you're doing. You don't know you're using logical reasoning, or you don't use that vocabulary, but you're absolutely using that IRAC is a term that attorneys use, that logical reasoning ability in intuition and psychic, phenomenon, I think.
So when it comes to tarot for you, do you find it challenging to, when you sit down with the cards, do you find it challenging to just kind of go immediately into the intuitive? Do you struggle with that? Do you feel that your analytical tends to come forefront? What is the experiences that you have when you sit down with the cards?
In the past, I did. So I think fresh out of law school, and when you're young and still, very sensitive to how people perceive you, and you want to be taken seriously as a professional, you have to be agnostic, right? And objective. And you're going to staunchly support a more psychological approach as something that has to have some valid backings. It has to have logical reasoning or rationale to it. I did struggle because you would get psychic hits or you could get downloads of something, and you wouldn't know what to do with it because you're using an extremely strict dogmatic approach to try to filter and communicate the information you're receiving. And it doesn't always work out like that. Whereas now I find that I'm a lot more open and fluid with that. So before, if you got a reading from me when I was 21, right, you would find that it follows a very logical process, and I would keep it very contained in a specific pattern of some kind. Whereas now, even card book meaning, like you could really see where I was extracting RWS canned tarot textbook card meanings.
Yeah.
Whereas now I think, it could be, you can make the argument that some of my interpretations of cards are wrong because I depart from, I depart from party principles. I'm a lot more open-minded to what's coming through. And even the deck you're using, I'm a lot more open-minded to adopting the artist point of view and using the illustrations to amplify whatever is coming out from the psychic hits. So I think there's been an evolution of how I approach cards. Now I don't think there is that hindrance, but before, absolutely, it was a challenge I had to overcome.
Interesting. You bring up intuition. How would you put intuition into words for yourself? I think that's a tough one for so many of us to describe, right? I'm putting you on a spot because it's not an easy word to describe, but for you, and perhaps you can speak to your definition, your understanding of intuition and what it means to you.
Yeah, intuition and the whole intuition versus psychic ability. I think I agree with all perspectives. I agree they're separate and distinct, but I also agree and understand why people use it interchangeably, because I think from the experiential perspective, as a person experiencing either psychic ability or intuition, it's hard to like parse between the two. So you use it interchangeably because that's how we actually experience it as people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think intuition, so for example, cooking lobster, right? You can scientifically follow, you can do the mathematics in how you broil lobster and follow it to a T, and it comes out perfectly, right? Perfectly cooked. Or like one thing I've learned to do is I put it in and I never measure, I never follow the time, I don't keep track of the time. You sit down and there's just a moment that you go, oh, it's ready. It's ready. And then I go and I pick it out and it's perfectly cooked. For me, that's intuition. Intuition is the same result of knowledge as the other process, the analytical process, but you don't follow like a scientific method or a step-by-step reasoning process to achieve there. It's almost like a shortcut to get to the same result. So that's intuition for me. Psychic ability, I think of that as something, there's no way within the realm of space-time I should know. But somehow I've like reached out an arm of some kind to pull it into me and then be able to output that. So psychic ability is something, that we would both agree unanimously is beyond my ability to know, but somehow I know it.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll never dare to cook lobster like that, but I'm a little bit tricky on how my shellfish has to be just perfectly cooked. So I would never trust my intuition on that. But it's amazing that you have it mastered. You mentioned cards, and you mentioned how you no longer stick to the traditional meaning or to just book assigned meanings, right? When we're talking about systems, and if we were to talk about three main systems, Marseille, Rider-Waite-Smith, and Zoss. In terms of those systems, would you agree that Rider-Waite-Smith, well, let me rephrase it. Would you agree that Zoss is more analytical, Marseille is more poetic? I don't actually know what to name Rider-Waite-Smith because I'm not a fan. So I want to be careful with my words and be mindful of people watching it because I know a lot of people love Rider-Waite-Smith. But how would you describe them in terms of poetic, intuitive? Well, suppose all of them are intuitive, but let's say poetic and analytical, cerebral and analytical.
That's interesting. I think there's a difference maybe, and I'm speculating. I have no idea what the artist or creator intentions are at this point. I can't speak in any confident way as to what Crowley and Lady
just your like perceptions of those texts. Like when I look at Marseille, I see poetry. When I look at Zoss, I see cerebral, analytical, very intellectual. Not that this is not intellectual. Again, I'm using different terminologies that are helpful to me understand. So to you personally, when you look at them, what do you see?
I think that's an interesting dichotomy, though. So I speculate that if you read the Book of Thoth, for example, in Crowley's writings, I don't necessarily think he's analytical. I think just because he takes on a Kabbalistic perspective, that's not analytical. That's very mystical. Whereas when you read Waite, like Pictorial Key and some of his, he's almost trying too hard to justify and find a psychological basis to the extent that, it was known in his time. He tries to find a very rational basis for everything. He wants to be very practical. So in terms of artist or creator intentions, I speculate it's almost the flip-flop, but then you're absolutely right. I think as we experience it, the readers who are using these decks that have created a consensus reality around the sub-communities of the RWS, the sub-community of the Marseille, the sub-community of the Thoth, yeah, you do see more analytical-minded people gravitating toward the Thoth. Poetic academics and most of the highbrow Ivy League academia rigor types gravitating toward the Marseille, and then the intuitive readers gravitating toward the Waite deck. But was that the intention originally? I think it's just weird how things evolve like that.
Yeah, I just realized as you brought up that Crowley's Book of Zoos is actually mystical, which I totally agree. And I think it's also, somebody recently pointed out that it's poetic. I made a video about my poetic decks, and I said Thoth is very analytical, so it's not even included in this poetic decks. And somebody said Thoth is very poetic because the Book of Zoos is poetry. And I thought, they're right. And it occurred to me as you spoke about thoughts also being very mystical, that how much I projected onto the deck, my own perception of it being analytical, because I myself analytical. So I wanted an analytical deck. I don't identify with right away, it's me. So I'm going to go ahead and over identify with this deck over here. So it's interesting. I would challenge anybody watching it to ponder their own relationship with the decks they have and their own self-identification, and to what extent it's actually true or just their own pure stuff. So when it comes to divination for you, do you distinguish between divination and between what I see now a lot of people do, myself included, is self-help? I heard Camila once mention, I took one of her courses, and she said that it was in, I think, early 60s, when the tarot moved into over self-identification, identifying with the tarot. And I see that a lot today, where it's all kind of psychological self-help, trying to figure out ourselves, journaling, and not so much prediction. What are your relationship with it? And do you think that's true, that tarot is moving away from divination and more into the self-help psychological?
I think the self-help psychological approach to tarot is gaining more momentum and prominence, but there has been a gentrification of tarot, because if I walk down Main Street and see that sort of corner neon psychic tarot reader, which I still love to go to just for scientific purposes, right? Just to see what it's still like. It's still psychic fortune telling divination, still that very fortune telling, spontaneous reading approach to the tarot, and not really self-help. It's still tall, dark, and handsome type, you know what I mean? And even on, for example, TikTok, you can look at TikTok, you can look at the pick a card daily, those sort of, that community, even on YouTube. There is still that very strong and robust fortune telling sub community and approach in tarot, but it seems to speak to a particular audience. Whereas that's why I say gentrification, whereas you do see a new audience being interested in the tarot. And I think for them to justify to themselves why they're interested in something that somebody very different from their own background and socioeconomic class is interested in, they need to justify it in some way. So they go the route of, the academia of tarot, the history of tarot, the psychology self-help aspect. This is just self-improvement. This is just self-help. Don't worry, I'm not doing fortune telling. I think that is kind of a way for them to justify. I do absolutely see it. Yeah. And it's interesting because even now, more and more, we need to see ourselves in the tarot. And if we don't see it, so I think there's that aspect of self-identification that's becoming stronger as well. Whereas before, when the majority of people read with the Marseille, I doubt there was a sense of self-identification and an entitlement to seeing yourself in like a Marseille deck. But we do see that now in, for example, more pictorialized pip decks. We have to see ourselves. So that is proof positive to me that you have a stronger evolution towards self-identification.
You don't think that has a slippery slope of leading toward the overblown narcissism? You can just say for yourself, or you don't even have to answer.
I think my face answered it.
But I think it's interesting, right? I think it's important to see when people say, I want to see myself represented in the tarot. I wonder, what does it mean? Like, what do you mean you want to see yourself represented in the tarot? Because it's interesting, this idea of the self and this idea of I and what am I, and to see yourself reflected back in an image. I can understand that clearly, of course, as a psychologist, and especially working in the field of transgender care, where it's important for people to see their gender identification represented. I get that. At the same time, it's an interesting paradox, right? What are we seeing when we're looking at an image? And to what extent is it really a reflection of us?
Well, I think that's where there is that, whether or not you're approaching tarot for fortune telling or tarot for self-help. If you approach tarot for self-help, and I do absolutely. So I can speak for myself, that self-identification component. When I see images or depictions of Asian Americans in tarot, it's self-help for me because my identity as an Asian American and being marginalized in that regard is absolutely part of something I have to process. So if we're talking self-help tarot, seeing myself literally represented in the tarot really helps. And so I think people with particular body types, people with particular identities, when they see themselves in the tarot and the combination, and they're approaching tarot for self-help, I do think, before we reach the level of narcissism, on some level of just self-help, you do need to see yourself because you need to process that aspect of your identity and that process of your experience.
Would you say that you need to see yourself in so much that you need it in order to, I guess what I'm thinking about is Marseille, for example, right? It's primarily pip deck. So it's actually very beautiful and fluid in that sense, where you can just, you're not seeing any particular representation. Even majors are pretty much very archetypically illustrated, where it's not necessarily depicting particular individuals. So I think it's interesting because that lends more to self-exploration and then exploring yourself in a bigger realm, versus self-identifying with an image. Because I'm still thinking about this need that we have to see ourselves reflected in an image. It's an interesting concept. Why we need that.
I wonder if it's also on some root cause level is almost a difference between the Western Enlightenment age philosophical approach that is the sort of the cornerstone of how we in the English speaking societies approach just life in general, where it is a more individualistic society, and then having that basis of being a more individualistic society, everything else sort of flowers from there. And that's why we see this in the tarot and how we approach the tarot, or just images in the tarot. Whereas at least from an Eastern society, it's more collective. And then when you see tarot decks being produced out of Asia, they don't all picture Asians. Like, isn't that interesting? Where they don't feel they have to have that same level of seeing themselves in the tarot in terms of the tarot decks. The East Asian publishers are creating, deck creators are creating.
So what does it usually tend to represent? Like, what are the most images represented coming from Asian creators?
Depends on who you ask. For me, based on my perspective, it seems to be the colonized mindset, because they all depict white people.
But it's still interesting because you feel that in Western culture, people are more likely to depict themselves, so more likely to depict decks with more diversity, right? Especially today, I think. Whereas from an Eastern, it's less likely that need for seeing yourself self-reflected.
And there's also, and so what's interesting is, even though what you see is all white people because of that colonized mindset, it's also the same body type as well, and the same, like, it's almost generic, like the human form. So before you even talk about race, the human form depicted in RWS-based decks created by Asian artists seem to, unless they are very Western influenced, right? So the Asian artists, it tends to be an abstract interpretation of the human form that because of the colonized mindset takes on that particular body type white person, right? But then I think it's because they're not necessarily saying this is a heteronormative cis white person. They're saying this is a very abstract concept of the human form, and because of a particular socialized experiences, we're just going to go with the default white person.
Interesting. Okay. In your personal practice, what do you tend to lean more toward? Do you tend to lean more toward reading cards for yourself from kind of self-help perspective, self-development, or is it for you more divinatory? And do you ever read also cards for your work, for a particular case you're working on, or for any kind of legal matter?
All of the above. I used to read, I read professionally for the longest time. And I think my first foray into the tarot, it's not that I didn't know you could read for yourself. It's just that I didn't read for myself. So my first beginner level of tarot, I read for others. And for, I think, the first 10 years of my work with the tarot was only reading for other people. Or if I read for myself, it was in a group setting, like, oh, let's see if he likes me or not. Let's do a reading for myself to see, if I'm going to pass physics, right? But it's not by myself alone in a room. It's with friends, in a circle of friends, that I'm reading for myself. That was the only time I read for myself. Otherwise, it was always reading for other people. And then now I do, I mean, obviously I read for myself, I read for other people, and I do sometimes. So for example, one little concrete example, you know how you have, when I redline a contract, I'm reviewing a contract to see if I'm done and if I've caught every single issue in the contract. I'll pull a card to be like, oh, did I catch all my mistakes? Did I catch all the issues? Or do I have to go back and reread the contract again to make sure I spotted all the issues? So I'll pull a
I
card.
love that.
Yeah, it's a very specific example, but that's something that I'll do.
How accurate is that for you?
I think it's pretty accurate. I mean, just for myself, I would consider it a lifesaver. Like I thought I was done, then I pull a card like 10 of swords. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to ignore that. So I go back in, like, oh shit, I did somehow overlook this really glaring issue that would be adverse to my client. So then like, oh, thank God.
Oh, I love that. That's interesting. That's an interesting way to utilize tarot, especially when somebody has a different type of profession. That's very interesting. So when it comes to divination, when it comes to your life big decisions, do you consult the tarot, or would you rather, if it's something big and your heart already gravitates toward it, or you just kind of on the fence of doing it, do you just trust it and go with it? Would you rather know or not know in other ways?
Medium level big, I will use the tarot. Big, no, I don't use the tarot. Isn't that interesting? It's like big, life-changing, life-altering type, like deep stuff. What does deep mean? But like really things that are on that level as you would perceive it, I don't consult divination. But I do though. So it's sort of a self, like in divination where I am the divination tool, if that makes any sense. So I trust myself as the divination tool. So it's not like I'm not using psychic or intuitive concepts. It's just that I'm not using an externalized tool. I become the tool for deciding those situations.
No, that makes hundreds. I do exactly the same thing where I just don't want to meddle. And if I know intuitively that I want it, but I'm afraid, which is the difference between I'm not sure, I just go for it. Your fear is a good type of fear, telling you to move forward. So I totally hear you on that. In what way do you think judicial, in way do you think, not so much judicial, but the law and karma and right and wrong comes into play for you when it comes to divination?
So what's interesting is I think the uncomfortable truth about the role of a lawyer, not a judge, but a lawyer, is that justice and fairness isn't necessarily my goal, right? My goal is my client's best interest. And I think when you start thinking about justice and fairness, these concepts are so like hard to pin down, and there's no one that's 100% innocent, 100% guilty. It's not like, it's not good versus evil in the practice of law. So the only way I can anchor myself is, okay, my goal and my only focus is my client's best interest, and I will advocate that zealously to the end like it's my own interest, and that's all I do. And I think in tarot, you do, as a tarot reader, have to apply that same rigor, because if you start thinking about justice, you have to remember that is karma, the judgment of karma and justice from your vantage point and your dogma. Our moral codes are all very different, and we don't share the same unanimous moral codes. And so if I start bringing in concepts of justice as a tarot reader for somebody else, I really quickly slip into the risk of being judgmental and imposing my worldview on somebody else. So that's where I do adopt a lot. As an advocate, I adopt a lot of those concepts into being a tarot reader. What is in your best interest? What is it you want? And that becomes what I want. And I advocate zealously for what is in your best interest. And I don't think about justice, because I think that's a slippery slope into dogma.
Okay, I like that a lot. I like that you tend to stay out of it when you read for others. I want to stick a little bit with divination, with fortune telling, with prediction, with the cards. It's so fascinating to me. It's such an interesting topic for me. And when you are using the cards for yourself or for anybody else, how do you perceive what is happening? What do you perceive is happening? Are the cards telling you a subconscious representation that subconscious psyche already knows of the person, and you're just deciphering the images what they're telling about the person? Are you opening up some kind of word of the future and just seeing one possibility of the many and presenting it to the person? How do you see what happens in that container between you and the cards, and whether it's for yourself or for anybody else, it doesn't matter, but between you and when you're actually divining, when you're actually trying to glance into the future?
I think it's a composite. It's a little bit of all of the above. It's both, right? I think we can't help when we use the word cold reading, it has such a negative connotation, but I don't think you can help it. I think that's part of the like on the subconscious. I don't know if I'm using that term right, but there's some level where like we're perceiving and receiving information just from like seeing each other, or the weird levels of it, whatever level of engagement we have with each other, even if it's emails or even just the birth chart, any of that. There is information we're just kind of getting and downloading, and we can't help but use that as part of the arsenal of factors that go into the consideration of what your tarot reading says for you specifically. But then there's also where I think if I see it as a very analytical approach that becomes predictive. For example, it's very analytical to say certain numbers or certain suits equals certain lengths of time.
Right.
That's an analytical process, but the end result is predictive, which is almost, conflicting with the concept of analysis. But that's what I do. So I will also then re-examine the cards from that analytical perspective to provide a prediction, like this will happen in 7 days, or I see this more as a short-term issue, or I see this as a long-term issue. I look at the sort of just whatever is coming through, and I kind of note the parties, like these are some of the characters that will be involved. This is who you need to look for. These are some of the signposts that will happen in the next 10 days, the next 50 days. And so that's analytical, but it's also predictive.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm always fascinated by what it is that we're doing. And I think that there's no one way to describe it. I agree. I think it's all of the above and so much more. For you, when it comes for the cards, right? Do you ever wonder, looking back at the tarot history, right? And especially your relationship, you have sounds like such a prolific, I would say, relationship with tarot. And you also have, you're an author, you wrote the book Holistic Tarot, which you have to know quite a bit about tarot to write such a book. Looking at the tarot history, does it start off, we're all just making this fucking up? We're all just making this, this whole association and correspondences and Kabbalah and astrology and yada, yada, yada. Do you ever just look at it and go, this is just all completely made up and it all can make sense, but it all absolutely cannot make any sense either?
Well, it's consensus reality. I think if you have a repeated number, like quantity and quality, like if you have a repeated number of people and like a whole like society that is all agreeing unanimously that this is assigned here, that is assigned there, and then we work within this universe of a consensus reality, it actually becomes true. So even though it's fabricated, which I agree with, it is kind of made up, but at the same time, if you work within that system of consensus reality, it's also true. And so if you look at Atea card meanings, it's very different, not just the numbering part, but even like how they interpret the Hermit card, the Magician, it's so different from RWS. And even between the different Golden Dawn systems, there's so many variations. And then now today, don't even get me started today, right? There's so many tarot books that have so many different perspectives on the cards. So in one sense, it's made up, but in another way, because there is a repeating pattern of themes around every single tarot archetype, that unanimous agreed upon assigned meaning creates like sort of an ecosystem that allows you to divine.
But consensus reality also doesn't make it right. It just makes it consensus reality, right?
Well, what's right and wrong? You know, you know what I mean? I think if it predicts something and then through some form of confirmation bias, I'm looking for something, or I navigate my life with a particular vantage point, and then I validate that this has happened to me. So it's right to me because I have a very narrow-minded, like biased perspective of my own life. It's right and it's real for me.
I wonder if fact, I thought maybe a fact is a better word. It doesn't make it factual, but then what is the fact, right? Because consensus reality is basically an accumulation of experiences that are replicated over and over and over until for people say, yeah, this works. But then it also can't help but ponder, are we all saying, yeah, it works because we use the same language and we assign the same translation, we assign the same meaning, and therefore we can only see what we presume is working versus what is not working. So it's interesting.
I think so.
Yeah, I always wonder to what extent it's all. I mean, none of it matter. I like the mystery of things. I like not knowing, and for me, it doesn't matter if I'm reading intuitively or if I'm assigning meanings. For me, it's all fun and enjoyable. So I don't think it's really that big of a departure from it. Do you dabble in occult at all?
Of course.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Which spheres or how would you describe you dabbling into occult? Like what interests you?
Taoist ritual magic, Taoist ceremonial magic is something that I watched being practiced growing up. I didn't really understand it. And then when I learned about Western ceremonial magic, it was a different setting in which I started learning about Western ceremonial magic and thinking, why does this look so similar? And the feel and everything of that is so similar to Taoist ritual magic and also Taoist mysticism. And in the Eastern world, there's ceremonial magic, which actually tends to be very male dominated, versus sort of mediumship. I don't know what they call it in English, but basically it's more like guttural is how I would describe it. It's channeling. It doesn't require a lot of pomp and circumstance. You use what's in your backyard. You follow the moon because I think moon phases is easier for you to look up in the sky and follow. Whereas astrology requires some scientific knowledge of the stars. And if you're a peasant, you don't have that. You're not using astrological correspondences and ephemeris tables. The ceremonial magician absolutely is. In terms of tools and in terms of ingredients, I can import and source ingredients from a particular astrological time. I can be very specific about all of that. Some people are not able to do that. So having both, and I grew up with both. So that's what I like to dabble in. But it's something that I approach because for me, it's how I connect to and keep a strong connection to the world beyond me. So in order for me to do what I want to do, I have to keep on strengthening that connection and attunement I have with that beyond world. And so to keep that strong connection with the beyond world, keep those channels open, it's a cult practice.
When I think about ceremonial magic, I think about opposite of cooking the lobster intuitively. I think about following, right, discipline and following guidelines. Do you utilize the same discipline and guidelines when you practice ceremonial magic?
Absolutely. It goes all the way down to my lifestyle. So for example, if I know I want to achieve or do something 3 months from now, then I begin now and I'll go vegan. I'll go on a Buddhist diet. Like what I eat, what I practice, what I do, my behavior will absolutely change for the next 3 months. I will be very mindful of how I comport myself because I want to keep the energy a particular way. I'll clean my house. I'll constantly do things even to my space to make sure my space is conducive, almost like a clean room in terms of laboratory science. I'll do things to my own home and this specific room that will happen in for 3 months before I even get to that point. And then the ingredients, I tend to, just it's a personality thing almost, right? But my personality, I'm going to be importing stuff. I'm going to get the best of every type of ingredient. I'm going to be very mindful of where I'm sourcing everything. And then when it's crafted, the oils I create, it's going to look at ephemeris tables. And then when I finally get to the event, everything is directional oriented. It's very, very particular.
Oh my God.
It's all about personality. Like I'm, I have that personality in every other aspect of my life. If I approach the occult, it's very obvious. I'm going to have that personality approach as well.
Yes, it parallels very much. And I expected you to answer that way. And I'm surprised you cook lobster intuitively because you have a lot of content. You have a lot of content on your website. You have a lot of publications. You've written a lot. You've written more than one book. And I know what it's like when you're a professional and then you also have this duality. And I don't know if this is for you a secondary work or if it's for you a passion. For me, this is a passion. And I know as a time, you have to really manage your time well if you want to create content over two different spheres. So I knew already that you're very, very disciplined because your life mirrors tremendous amount of discipline. So I'm surprised you intuitively cook lobster and you're so disciplined when it comes to ceremonial.
I 100% cook intuitively. I don't measure anything, but then I do also think it's analytical because I began from a place of following recipes and having measuring cups and doing it very scientifically. And I think if you've been cooking for 20, 30 years, at some point, is it intuitive or is it just like muscle memory. So I don't even know how to describe it. Like I just have a muscle memory of when lobster is done, when steak is done. Like I don't put in a thermometer when I'm cooking steak. I know when to take mine out for blue rare. I know how to leave it in for medium rare, and then how for my father-in-law's, well done. But it's because and also knowing ingredients. I don't need to go to recipes because I know how butter works. I know how, baking soda and baking powder works, and the proportions of baking powder and baking soda to create a particular texture of cookie. And so it's still scientific, but it's intuitive now because I think it's just something that you've done for so long. You don't really need
innate. It's like becomes an innate dance that you can do without even thinking. I get it too. Yeah. What for you, the tarot world, your YouTube content, things you have, classes and courses you have on your website for you, and you have some intensive. I took your astrology course. I never finished it all the way through because it was a lot of great information. But it's a great course. I didn't get it through it because I didn't have discipline. So you do have a lot of material out there, a lot of offerings. For you, tarot, how do you see this? Do you see this as my second job, my career, my second vocation? Do you see this as hobby or a passion?
It was a hobby. And I mean, that's how it began. It began as me needing some outlet, like an outlet that's very different from my practice, from my career and the practice of law. And I think I was missing something in my life at some point back in 2012. And so I returned to something I was very interested in as a child, which was the tarot. And holistic tarot was kind of a fluke. It kind of happened over Thanksgiving break one year, and then I didn't know what to do. Should I self-publish it? It was all kind of a fluke. And then even the pseudonym Benebell Wen, I spent 3 seconds thinking about it because I knew I wanted to use a pseudonym to keep it separate. And then my publisher, it was just like, oh, we need to put a name on it. What name do we put down? Benebell Wen. Like it just, and then it stuck, and it was just completely stuck, and I'm stuck with it, And so a lot of it's just so like things that were like just like that, and then now it's like set in stone. I'm like, shit, how is this so set in stone now? And then like it just kind of progressed, and then I don't know, it was like a monster that got out of control. And then at some point it's what it is now. And then like because I spend so much time on it, yeah, some of it is monetized, absolutely, because I think it's just a natural, when you live in a capitalistic society and you put in a certain amount of time and energy and work product, it becomes monetized because
100%.
you have to integrate into a capitalistic world. But yeah, it began as something that was a creative outlet that just became a monster that got out of control.
That's so great. I have a friend. I was talking to her that you're the next one on my interview list, and she said, "Yeah, Benebell or whatever her name is that even her name?" And I thought that never occurred to me. That is not even that is a pseudonym. And now you can always scrap everything like I did, delete everything, and rebrand yourself completely with a different name. You can always do that, but I see what you mean. Do you feel the pressure is that now you're kind of like you mentioned being set in stone? Do you feel that pressure that now you're tied to what has, I guess, to the representation of you in a tarot world?
So the third book that it's not yet out, but after I finished writing it and it was going to be contracted to be published, the book on I Ching, I had to I really wanted to publish it under my real name, my legal name. And then I was like, but that opens up a can of worms I'm not prepared to deal with. Because if you you know what I mean? I was like, if I publish this book under my legal name and then there's still Benebell Wen, and then like, how do you promote this book, which you have to do? Like, what do I do with this? Like, it's just this whole can of worms I didn't even know how to grapple with. So I'm like, all right, fuck it, Benebell Wen. There's nothing you can really do. At a certain point, it was like, point of no return, right? And so, yeah, but I mean, I think I still struggle with that because I do feel like even your real name has a brand. We all have a personal brand, even if you don't mean to, but there's a thing there, right? So there's a, I keep using the word ecosystem, but there's something there that you almost feel, you almost self-censor to stay within the parameters of what you created. And this is not just a public figure, private figures do this all the time. And so now that most people only have one, or you have private life and public life, which is different. But now I have different identities and then public and private life within those identities. So now I have like this whole matrix of who I am. And
oh my God.
Like, how do you deal? Like, it's very hard to constantly stay on top of that.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and I'm getting overwhelmed because I'm very territorial with my name. Even when I got legally married, which I did not want to do, I refused to take my husband's name, even though my last name is impossible to pronounce and his is Kennedy, so easy to pronounce. I thought, heck no, I'm not going to have all of my work under somebody else's name. So I'm very territorial with my name. So it's very, I hear you challenge. I suppose you can play along and have fun with it and publish it under dual authorship, Benebell Wen, and your real name, and then you'll still be able to market it. And people will just say, well, who's the secondary author? And when they go to the back of the page, it's like, oh, it's one and the same. The duality split within her.
But it negates the whole purpose of having it separate in the first place, which is so that people in the professional sector don't Google me and find all this tarot and occult stuff, right? That was the
I
whole
see.
point of the
I see. You
pseudonym
wanted it
to
to
begin
keep
with.
completely separate. Yeah. Is it challenging? Does the legal world you work in, do people and your colleagues, do they know this other aspect of your life? No.
A couple of them do. So for example, there are a couple people who do know, but it's after they've known me for 5 years, 6 years, and people who've known me for a very long time, and I've really, really vetted them out. Like I trust them. At that point, I really trust them. Like if I had a kid, I trust them, then they will know. But for the most part, most of my professional colleagues have no idea.
Yeah. Is that a, and you don't have to answer that if it's the personal, is that the personal decision out of some form of perhaps fear or of people knowing and confusing what you do over here with witchcraft? And I'm using witchcraft because I feel like it's a word that has been so demonized and weaponized. Is that where it's coming from, or you just would rather keep the two split and separate?
There's that aspect of it, absolutely, because even the word, so when I've learned, I have a certain concept of the word witchcraft and the word occult and esoteric from our circles and the networks that we run in, but sometimes I forget that the word witch has very vastly different connotations to someone who's absolutely outside of that community. And so you still have that. And I think if they come across things about me without me being able to be there in that space to give context, they run with that idea with their own preconceived conceptions. And I think that becomes very difficult. And it's hard not to judge. Like even in the professional world, you always Google colleagues, you Google opposing counsel, anybody you're about to work with, because that's actually due diligence. Like you want to know who you're dealing with so you know how to approach that situation, of course. And I think one of my past experiences was under my legal name, I had started a fashion design side business, right? And then when I went to court, opposing counsel would be like, is that handbag designed by you, fashion designer extraordinaire? Like with that really like
Ooh,
that like
nasty.
that tone, you know?
Yeah.
And then you're just like, that's so unprofessional, but that's not even, you know, like you can tell that they have that. And then as being a woman already, having to
Yeah.
be combative in those spaces, I already have to monitor how I am perceived on such an intense level to then have factors that are out of my control. It's not something I can grapple with. So I need to keep factors within my control in order to be perceived in a particular way to be taken seriously. Mm. So already even the fashion part was already getting to me. Imagine the tarot occult part.
Oh my God. Yes, I imagine and I hear you struggle. I was struggling the same in my profession, especially with the latest anti-trans stuff that's going on, anti-trans legislation. I thought, oh my God, it's like a slip away from, oh my God, look at her. She's witching people into transitioning. And eventually I just said, you know what, fuck it. If they can't see projective psychology in tarot, then they'll have to call Rorschach and all other projective testing psychological tools as witchcraft too. So then we're going to have to call the whole profession as witchcraft. So I just kind of said, fuck it. But I hear you. It is challenging in this world because people are so quick to extrapolate what they want and utilize it against you versus letting it be situated in a context, in a broader context. Yeah. I want to talk about.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Especially in your field, I think when people already have biases that are and prejudices against something, they will pick at everything, especially ad hominem attacks. And so it almost becomes this unfair burden where you have to have a very clean, spotless background that conforms to everything in order for you to be taken seriously about a very controversial or progressive topic. And if you don't have all your ducks in a row, like they will just use that over and over again against you, that you can't even get to your main point.
I know, but I refuse to conform. And my 17 years of solely working with trans and non-binary adults is an expertise in of itself. And so you want to push against that with this.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I want to talk about this. I have first edition. And what is this, by the way? You sent it out to...
Oh, that's a special, so I collected it from, I think, the dust from 7 different holy sites around the world. I can't remember them off I wrote it all down. So for example, one of it, I think, is from Iceland, when my husband visited Iceland. One of them is a monastery in Taiwan. One of them is in South America. So different places we go, we collect the dust there and particular holy sites. So I mix that all together, and that's what that little thing is.
I have 2 of this. And the reason why I have it is people are wondering why I have it, and they don't. When you made this deck, you had a few copies that had damages on the boxes, and you emailed and you said, I have some with the damaged boxes. If you want them, they'll be shipped to you faster. So I was one of people said, yeah, I don't really care, it's there for the box. And you sent a picture, there was like an oil stain.
Yeah.
And when you send it with this, and you also generously asked me if I want to pick a number that I want the deck to be signed. And I think the 666 was already taken. So I don't know if I think you chose it for me, 777.
Oh, nice.
Which is a beautiful number. I love 7 is one of my favorite number, 8 being my primary favorite number, but 7 is my secondary favorite number. So this is perfect. I want to talk about this deck, and I want to talk about this deck because I always wonder who the creators who creates the deck. But first, I want to ask you, when you were creating this deck, I feel that a creation of something so well, tarot to me is a different item. It's a different type of tool because it's used collectively by millions and billions of people. It's akin to an icon, for example, where people just continue to put in energy into it again and again. Tarot is the same thing. So many people utilize it, and because so many people use it in pretty much similar shape or form everybody else does, it becomes a spiritual item that is very highly energetically charged. This is why, the cross is energetically charged, because everybody's praying to a cross, right? So when you work on a deck of cards, on tarot, that is already such supercharged item, what's happened to you? Do you mind sharing because I always feel that while working on this, it was working on you internally. What was the process feel like, and what did you feel shifted within you?
Well, working on the deck before I left my house, there was one level of transformation that happened during that period, right? And then once the deck left my home, all 1,000 for the first edition that you have, and then once all of these copies of the deck, which are just pieces of a whole, leave my house and are in the world, and it's in that consciousness, and then a different transformation. So there's two periods or 2 steps of transformation that happen. So in terms of now that it becomes an icon just like anything else, you definitely feel that. And I think every single tarot deck that happens to you. So for example, if you look at it, there's many sub-communities of tarot decks, the Mariel, the Hermetic Tarot, Light Seers Tarot, right? Like all of the Slow Holler or the This Might Hurt Tarot, all of these decks, they create a sub-community, and that sub-community has it feels so specific, right? Like it's a very specific something. And there's a concentric circle where all of them are encompassed by this wider concept of a tarot community. And the tarot community is a concentric circle within the mind, body, spirit, spirituality, even new age, unfortunately, community, and so you have that, but within that one first circle of the tarot community, they do have these separate little spheres. And so I think the SKT is just one of those spheres. And I do see it having a very distinct persona and a distinct use and purpose and all of that and implications that I think you will see in every single deck.
I had no idea there were sub-communities based on the decks, but
Oh, they're not
I'm not
formal. I don't think
surprised.
it's formalized. Like it's not formalized,
Right, right,
but I
right,
think
right.
if
They
you're
just
observing,
collectively,
see it. Like you
yes,
see there is a very specific
yeah,
community, like there's patterns of the type of people that gravitate towards certain decks, and then they kind of form
yes.
like an ad hoc community. They're not formalizing it, but you still see it.
No, 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 I totally get it. I got what you mean. They're not groups, not
Right,
formal groups. They're just collective of people that gravitate because they have a common interest, and it's this particular tarot deck, which makes sense. I'm always learning so much about tarot tube and tarot tube world. So another thing that I wanted to ask you about this deck is when you create something like this that is clearly personal, right? Because not only are you in this deck particular that you combined the imagery and symbolism from Rider-Waite-Smith combined with Thoth, but also I would venture to say some of the images are perhaps some form of your internal subjective archetypes. When you disseminate it and 1,000 copies go out into the world, then you have maybe more copies to go. I don't know in what stage, third, fourth, fifth edition you deck is, but lots of people have gotten the deck. Do you ever feel the energetic, any kind of energetic feel or shift with having this out there in a collective, having you, an extension of you in collective? And I'm not talking about coming across reviews or comments, just energetically. How does it feel like anything? Or do you feel that you're very good with the boundary where you just let it go and that energy is out there and it's no longer yours?
I think I'm very good with the boundary, and that began with having the foresight or anticipating that that might happen, having attachment issues. So I knew from the get-go with the black and white edition, having attachment issues would be a concern. So how do I make sure I don't have those attachment issues? And one of the things was having people make it their own. You color the deck, you modify it, you work with it. And yeah, exactly. When people, I see so much of that. And then when people make it their own, when I see what people have done to the cards and it's no longer something I recognize as my own work, there's no attachment because it's out there. And I do see how that energy, that collective energy that you're talking about, of all those decks out there, it's taken on a life of its own that's very different and independent from me. Some of it still has my characteristics. It's still inherited some of my characteristics, but the other half of it is not me anymore. It's something completely evolved out of whatever I was beyond me. And so I can see that it's its own independent thing. And I have that ability to detach and see it as its own separate and distinct identity. But that was something that I knew right from the start that I would have to be thoughtful of. Even as an artist, I know that I don't want to be possessive over my art. So I'm very mindful of allowing people to do whatever they want with the artwork, to really craft in their own way. And that is part of how you train yourself as an artist, to not be possessive or attached to your art.
So was having the stack be black and white and for people to engage with the coloring, which initially, and I believe it came, I still have it somewhere, a very big book with this deck, and there were instructions, specific instructions on how to engage with the coloring. I think there was an order to go through with two. Was, in my understanding, was the intent to color was what Golden Dawn tradition did. You create your own tarot deck, and you have this engagement, you have this kind of alchemical process with it, and that seems like was one reasoning for it. And the other reasoning for it, would it be fair to say, to also create this detachment, the protective barrier?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's both. And also, I think one of the reasons I thought that the coloring aspect of it was so important is because it is sort of a documented process for yourself. You're documenting for yourself your path working and your journey. So one of the things I do, so when it's black and white, it's kind of like seeing it hazy. You can't see the landscape, or seeing it at night. You don't have a view of the landscape yet. And then you navigate that world, you adventure into that world, and then you become the light that shines onto this world, and you start seeing the world. But then because we're still human, you only see certain parts in full color, or there's certain aspects to the path working that becomes more prominent in your vision and memory. So when you color that part that was most prominent in your path working journeys, when you look at your cards again, you immediately, it's like a calling card. You immediately, it's like taking notes. You immediately remember what that path working experience was like for every single one of the 78 cards. Whereas if you didn't color, It's easy to forget, just like not taking notes. It's easy to forget.
Yeah.
But when you color and you take notes, you'll always have with you the clear, the picture clear memory of all of those path working experiences.
I must be a bad student because I keep this tag because it's personal for me. I think it's very interesting rendition of art. I also like it that has so much of my personal energy by coloring it in. And I pulled it out and I was going through this for this interview and I thought, why did I only color one particular, every single card, I color only one particular thing in it. And don't remember if that was the instruction to do so or why I did so. But now when you mention past working and you colored that one particular piece, looking back, this is interesting. This is going to be an interesting psychological reflection for me later on today. Why I colored that? What is it about this that stands out from entire imagery? And it's interesting because it's all different. Like here, it's only the helmet that he's wearing. It's interesting. And your recent deck is in color.
Yes, the most recent one is in color, where it's more like for a greater mainstream. It's for people who don't necessarily, who want to sort of have that landscape view visible to them already. And now we're exploring the cradles of civilization. Now we're experiencing how these mystical concepts have concretized into various civilizations, cultures, and religious traditions over the centuries and centuries of human existence. So that's why every card is very specific to particular areas of the world, because now what we're doing is it's that idea of like the Prisca Theologia, this concept of one uniting faith. Not that, there's only one faith, but that how do you get the composite of all perspectives and create a unity out of the the many differences. And so that's what I was going for with the third deck.
So there's no more black and white versions.
No, that was a limited edition. There's only 1,000 copies out there. And not even because I have a couple for myself. So technically there isn't even 1,000 in the world. There's
great.
950 in the world, right?
I love the idea of coloring. I love the idea of putting yourself into it. I really wish more decks came out with that option. I really would love to get my hands on white sketches of Marielle for that reason, so that I can also color it in. With this deck, what was the reasoning to depart from the black and white? Was it just because you wanted to keep this edition special, or was it just because that was for this and that is for something else?
Well, the first one was in black and white because I didn't know how to do color. So it was a technical skill limitation thing, like I only knew how to do pen and ink line drawings. And then I had no background in digital art or coloring or whatsoever. And when I was first doing it in colored pencil, it just didn't look good. Like when I was doing it for myself, I was like, I can't make it look good with colored pencil. And because of my art style, colored pencil is like more soft and subtle and subdued. And if you look at my art style, it's very kind of sharp. And so it's a little hard to work with just colored pencil, that medium specifically. Watercolor was also hard. Oil paint was something I considered, but oil painting, you need those big like it was a whole process that I wasn't sure I was able to do. And so then I was thinking, how am I going to make this in full color? The pandemic hit, everybody was sheltered in place. And so I took the time I bought one of those little computer thingies, and then I taught myself graphic design. I taught myself digital art. I also went back to school myself in terms of learning the art basics, art theory, art history. So I basically created a curriculum of learning art for myself, modeled after MFA programs I could find online. And then I taught myself art and then produced the full color deck.
Well, I'm glad I have the special edition, and I'm glad that I have two of this stuff. I keep this actually in a nice marble box with my thought stack, so it's watching over my thought stack. To finish up today, looking at the world of tarot and looking at where the tarot is going, instead of asking you where do you think it's headed, I'd like to ask you, what do you feel is missing?
Wow, what do I think is missing from the tarot community?
Let's do a two-part question. What do you think is missing from tarot community, and what do you think is missing from tarot?
I think what I actually think is probably controversial and will get me in trouble. But
that's okay. You don't have to answer that.
Oh no, I don't mind answering whatever. Like, well, I'm not new to get into trouble, right? I think what's missing is not knowledgeable voices, but the voices who truly have this profound alchemically transformed experience with the tarot that bring something truly like progressive to tarot. Like they're the ones who could take tarot, they're the Waite or the Crowley of today. They're the ones that can take tarot to the next level because of who they are and what they've done. Those voices are missing or are not silent. I don't think they're silent. I just think that they're not amplified. Those are the voices never platformed. And so that's what I see missing.
And do you see this missing from tarot or tarot community or both?
I think both, because how do you separate the two? Because the tarot community dictates what tarot looks like. Whether you like it or not, I don't think you can separate the two.
Let me think about that. Tarot community dictates what tarot looks like.
At least the visible, like how tarot presents. Maybe not what tarot looks like in terms of the esoteric or the occulted face of tarot. Of course, no, I don't think so. But I think the exoteric and the face presented of tarot, the community does kind of dictate that.
Are you talking about the art, like supply and demand? What people
absolutely the art, even what is popular, what system is popular, what the art looks like, the aesthetic value of it, production value, and even what is said about the tarot. So if you want to get out of the superficial realm and into the substantive realm, even what is spoken about the tarot is dictated by the tarot community and the most popular prominent voices in the tarot community, and not necessarily the voices of what I was saying earlier, the ones who have this
the influence
alternate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the influence. Okay. Well, that's okay. I don't disagree with you. I agree with that. I'm disagreeing how that applies to me because I don't like to identify with the masses, but that's me, right? And so usually when I see people gravitate towards something, I try to push myself to run in a very opposite direction. And it's just always how I've been in my work and in my life. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to talk to you. It's been interesting to hear your perspective, and it's been interesting to hear your views, especially on the analytical, because I feel for me, it's personally a struggle when I sit down with the cards, my analytical mind kicks in. I'm now getting in the phases of my life where the intuitive is starting to take over, but it's still very early for me. So it's always great to hear somebody that has this duality of analytical and the poetic.
And I'm such a fan of your work. I totally love following your channel. I was upset when you left. I was very sad. I took it very personally. I was offended.
Did you really?
No, you know what I mean. Like because you feel entitled to videos that you love. Like we do, right?
Yeah, that's the problem we'll have.
You expect the videos to be fed into your, like you want to see, and then when suddenly it stops, you're like, what? Natalia, where's your video? Like, just
and I think perhaps it's a good thing that I deleted it because it was a good practice for me to detach and annihilate some things that had attachment for myself. But also, I think you point out to something a lot of us, myself included, struggle with this entitlement to the content, entitlement to anything. People putting images out there, people putting on work. And I feel that sometimes too, and I have to catch myself and pull myself back and say, this was never yours to begin with. I went to a Ceremonia website yesterday. It's a person who made the necklace because I was thinking about getting maybe some more items. And her Instagram just basically says, I served esoteric community for 5 years and I'm departing to do something else. And I went, no more items. I can't purchase anything from you anymore. What? And then I had to pull myself and say, all right, it was never yours to begin with, and good for them for moving on. So I think we all have to sit with the sense of something belonging to us or something that's ours, because in reality, and like you're a creator, and you can anytime suspend your content, modify your content, rewrite your book, remodify your deck, right? It's never really anybody's.
It's fascinating how that entitlement works and the sort of the ethos that is sprung out behind that. So, for example, do you notice how people are almost obligated to say why they are not going to be creating videos for the next 2 weeks? Or, you see it all the time. Things like that, they feel like they have to explain to you why they're going on vacation. Like, why do they need to do that? But they still feel, and in a way, they do. Like, you know what I mean? It's that weird thing where we have this entitlement, and even get to even more on another level, like we feel entitled to our idols agreeing with our opinions. So when your idol doesn't agree with your opinion, you take that very personally, and there's a level of entitlement over how other people think as well. And so you just see all these different like levels of entitlement happening in our society today, and that level of entitlement is the root cause of all of these conflicts.
Yes, but it's so messy. And, I think it's so important for people to just be so careful with that, especially with people we idealize or people we devalue. Anytime something changes in those personal views, and suddenly it's like, you're not my idol anymore, and how dare you? And it's talking about now over personifying, right? Over identifying now, instead with an image in tarot cards, you're literally over identifying with the person you see. And I think that's a slippery territory, because if you're over identifying with another person, then who are you? Now you're so enmeshed with our identity, you lose yours.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a good part to end on, encouraging everybody not to over identify with things, not to feel entitled. This interview is going to be up. It might be deleted. It might not be deleted. Who knows? But enjoy it, file things last. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. What a pleasure. And yeah, thank you.
Pleasure's all mine, Natalia.
Thank you.